Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on an overview of the CCATS module, Assumptions to the Annual Energy Outlook of 2025. My name is Crystal Stabell, and I'm a Senior Program Coordinator here at USCA, focusing on our consensus program. The United States Energy Association is a nonprofit, apolitical, non-lobbying organization founded in 1924. USCA's mission has two pillars of equal importance. USCA serves as a resource by convening energy stakeholders to share policy, scientific, and technological information to foster the advancement of the entire energy sector. Internationally, USCA promotes energy development by expanding access to safe, affordable, sustainable, and acceptable energy in partnership with the US government. The Consensus Program, which was launched in 2008, is a cooperative program with the US Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management to promote consensus on the need for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and other clean fossil energy technologies. While dramatic progress continues to be made in developing these technologies, neither the progress achieved to date nor the full capability of CCUS and clean fossil energy technology is widely understood. Yet it must be if they are able to have significant global impact. And the reality is that much of the world will continue to use fossil fuels for the decades to come, further underscoring the need for these technologies. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and it will be available on our website along with the slides within 24 hours of the end of this webinar. Any questions that you may have can be put in the chat and will be answered at the end. Now, to tell us a little bit about our speaker. Anna is the team lead for the macroeconomic and emissions team in the Office of Energy Analysis at the US Energy Information Administration. Her team produces a macro driver and tracks emissions activity for the EIA models used in the Annual Energy Outlook, the International Energy Outlook, and the Short-Term Energy Outlook. They developed the new carbon capture model first released in AEO 2025. Prior to joining the EIA, Anna was an assistant professor of finance at the Southern Methodist University and an assistant economist at the New York Federal Reserve. She holds a PhD in finance from the Wharton School of Business and a bachelor's degree in economics and mathematics from the University of Pennsylvania. Anna, thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Crystal. And thank you very much to the USCA for inviting me to speak today. As Crystal said, my name is Anna Cororaton. I'm the team lead for the macro and emissions team. And today I'll be going over assumptions for our new carbon capture model that we released for AEO 2025. Called the Carbon Capture, Allocation, Transportation, and Sequestration Module, which we lovingly refer to as CATS. Before I start, I know Crystal provided some background about myself, but as you may have heard, I'm an economist by training. I became more involved in emissions work as I became a team lead for this team. But the model that I'm about to present, or the assumptions and the results for this model, were actually developed by a group of modelers at EIA who have since left. So if I might not have the technical engineering background to answer your questions. If that happens, if you have any questions, I'm happy to go back to other experts here at EIA and then let you know if I have answers, if you have questions at the very end. But I will try to do my best to share more about CATS. Okay, so to get started, so first about the Annual Energy Outlook that we released in 2025, so the AEO. So it is one of EIA's flagship products. It publishes long-term projections for the U.S. energy system, and it is we produce this annually. AEO uses a large-scale energy modeling system called NEMS, or the National Energy Modeling System, and for AEO 2025, which we released in April, it included 3 new modules. So the first is the Hydrocarbon Supply Module, or HSM, and this replaced the old Oil and Gas Supply Module, if you're familiar with NEMS. The second one is the Hydrogen Markets Module, or HMM, and then the third is CATS, which is our topic for today. Okay, so where does CATS sit within NEMS? Here is I guess a diagram of what NEMS looks like. On the left, you have the green supply modules, and then on the right, you have orange demand sector modules, and then other modules that are peripheral in purple. So you have transformation modules, basically the non-demand and non-supply modules. So you have the transformation modules here on the bottom, and then 3 on the top are handled by my team. So CATS, the macro module, which produces the macro drivers, and then emissions policy module, which tracks basically total emissions coming out of NEMS. Okay, so what is CATS? So CATS models the potential carbon capture industry in the US. As we know, this is a very small industry at the moment, but our projections are until 2050. So we wanted to basically develop a model that will take into account what we think will be the major players in the carbon capture industry over the next few decades. So it is built as an optimization model that determines the flow of endogenously produced CO2 from other NEMS modules, and we allocate the CO2 to destinations. So as I'll talk about later, these 2 destinations are going to be CO2 EOR and saline storage. So for AEO 2025, we include policy only as of December 2024, and any policies as of this year, for example, are going to be incorporated in future AEOs. So all the results that I'll talk about are mostly until December 2024 policy. We wanted to design this model to be very flexible so that we can accommodate potential future changes. We already know from this year that there's going to be changes that we want to incorporate to policy, and the way that we developed CATS can definitely accommodate that. Okay, so what is the market representation in CATS? So the first 3 bullets here are, I guess, like the most important aspects of the model. And we have a little diagram on the right so you can visualize. So the first one is we wanted to represent potential economic sources of CO2 from industries that we represent in NEMS that have significant carbon capture potential. So in particular, we include power generation, which includes coal power plants, natural gas power plants, and BECCS. And then we have 4 other industries: natural gas processing, ethanol, hydrogen, and cement. So those are represented as the green dots on this little diagram on the right. We also represent CO2 transportation using pipelines, and we have data on the existing pipeline network, even though it's quite small. And then the third is the destinations, basically domain where this CO2 is going. So we represent 2 destinations. One is for CO2 EOR, and as I mentioned previously, and also CO2 storage in onshore saline formations. We don't include any offshore for now. So we represent these 3 sort of ingredients as a network of nodes and arcs on the US map, which I'm going to show you in our next slide. Okay, so this is what the potential network, this is the input that we provide to our optimization model. And this is, I guess, like the different possibilities that the optimization model can pick to deploy carbon capture in the US. So we have different node types, as I described, in much more detail on this US map. So we have the supply nodes, the transshipment nodes, and the CO2 EOR and storage nodes. And then we have 2 different archetypes. Existing ones, so there are very few of them, and potential potential arcs. So arcs are going to be the connections between different nodes. So the potential arcs are the ones that the model can choose to invest in and develop as it basically receives CO2 supply that it wants to bring to different destinations. So you have different color codes in here. So blue is source to saline storage, and brown is source to EOR demand. So we allow direct connections directly from source to these two locations. We have transshipment nodes that you can see are, so these are in yellow, connected as yellow arcs. These are, since we don't know where these transshipment or pipelines will be built, we assume a uniform grid over the US. And then we have the transshipment nodes to their final destination, so either saline storage or EOR demand. Okay, so I'm going to go through these three parts of the model in greater detail. So first, let's look at supply representation. And this is a map of the supply nodes that we have in the CATS model. So I guess let me back up a little bit. So CO2 supply, since we are integrated as part of the larger NEMS ecosystem, we have to work well with how the other modules are defined. CO2 supply from these other NEMS modules are provided at a pretty aggregated level, so at the census division level, but this is a little too aggregated for CATS to have meaningful results. So there are only 9 census divisions, and as you can imagine, it's going to be really hard to understand where supply is going to demand with just like 9 big regions in the US. So what we do is we disaggregate the endogenous CO2 supply volumes that we receive from NEMS to point source facilities. And we get data on these point source facilities from the NETL carbon capture retrofit database. And this basically has a list of different facilities across the country and their costs for retrofitting or for installing carbon capture technology. So we combine this with a few other data sources, in particular EPA's GHG database, to figure out the locations, and we map them here on this map for you on the right. So you can see there are, in yellow, there are several ethanol facilities in the Midwest that could come online. And then there are a bunch of natural gas processing facilities in green in the West South Central area that could also come online. So we have a list of cost estimates from the NETL CCRD database. Okay, so what is the capture potential for these different industries? So here is a table that we have in the assumptions document, which shows you the total capture potential by geography and also by type of industry. And I just wanted to highlight that coal power plants have a lot of capture potential in the US, and also natural gas power plants. Okay, so moving on to transportation, we only represent transportation of CO2 by pipeline for now in CATS. We know there are a few other ways to transport CO2, like rail or barge, but to keep things simple, we are just, and this is the first year we have the model, we're sticking to pipelines only. But our pipelines can have different diameters and number of pumps. And we have two different types of pipelines, depending on basically the length that they traverse over the country. So the first are what we refer to as trunk lines. So these pass through the transshipment nodes here in yellow, so the ones that are connecting the uniform grid. These are around 400 miles long. And you can think of these as like the larger interregional pipelines that connect, the potential carbon capture network in the US. And then the smaller ones, which are direct from supply to demand, or can be from supply and demand to a close transshipment node that is close by, those are referred to as spur lines. And those are between 100 and 200 miles. So for the cost estimates of these types of pipelines, including various engineering characteristics, also diameter and number of pumps, we use the NETL CO2 transport cost model to back out our cost estimates. And in addition, we also have spoken to DOT, and we were able to get a layer of their national pipeline mapping system, where we can represent basically the existing pipelines that are already in place. And you can kind of see them in the map in this like mountain region area. The reason why it's not uniform is because we already know that they're there. And then here in the Permian, and then here in the Gulf Coast. Okay. So here's just an example of some of the cost estimates that we are able to that we have using the NETL transport cost model. So for example, I should mention these transport costs are also regional. So for example, for New England, a pipeline of length 150 miles will cost $51 per ton of CO2 to develop, and so on and so forth. We have a full list of these costs, a spreadsheet of a full list of these costs in the assumptions document. Okay, what about CO2 EOR representation? So CO2 EOR is demand that we get endogenously from the hydrocarbon supply module. So this hydrocarbon supply module is basically the upstream production of models, the upstream oil and gas production side of the energy system. And they endogenously have demand for EOR, given what's happening with the rest of the energy system and the rest of the economy. So we get that endogenously from them. EOR is represented at the geological formation and county level, which is also something determined by the HSM module. And here is a map from HSM that tells us where these EOR nodes are. In terms of storage, we are only modeling onshore storage in the lower 48 US states, so the contiguous US area. We get the cost assumptions for developing and investing in these storage sites from the NETL saline storage cost model. And we combine information. We combine information from this NETL model with other mapping layers that include information on state and federal lands and urban protected areas, and we make sure to cross-check so that we are not, we don't use storage sites that are on top of cities, for example. Okay, and here's a summary of the storage areas that are represented in CATS. This is in order of size from largest, well, the largest ones are here on the left. So in the South area, basically that area where Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Arkansas are, that has the largest square mileage area in terms of saline storage capabilities. There's a maximum number of over 9,000 injection projects that could be developed in that area. also with a pretty high injection rate. So the amount of metric million tons of CO2 that can be injected into a particular project each year. So I should mention that our in total, we have a data set of about 50 billion tons of CO2 capacity at the sites that we represent in the CCATS module, which is a big number and way more than than the CO2 emissions that the US produces. So there's, for all intents and purposes, we think of close to an infinite capacity on this side. Okay, so here's a look at the initial network that we put in the CATS model for the early model years. So this represents the existing carbon capture facilities, existing pipeline network. So now you can see more clearly where those are. So the black lines in these three regions that I mentioned previously, existing CO2 EOR demand at the state or Texas RRC level, and also sequestration. So we represent our saline storage as nodes, so you can see the ones that are currently open. So we are representing 13 supply facilities, 11 of which go to CO2 EOR, and 2 to saline storage. Okay, so with those model ingredients, we can talk a little bit more about model structure. And here's a diagram of what happens. I think I have referred to how it works already in NEMS. But basically, we take in CO2 supply from these 5 types of supply facilities in NEMS. So again, power plants, cement, natural gas processing, ethanol, and hydrogen. They provide volumes of CO2 to CATS. We then basically combine, well, we take into account cost information, both variable costs and investment costs for transportation. So for developing and putting in place pipelines, and then also for developing storage sites. So with those investment and variable costs, and with the policy incentives that are in place, the model basically solves for the least cost allocation of supply to demand. So to CO2, EOR, into storage. Within the optimization, so after the optimization problem solves, we are able to get implied prices for these areas by region, and we return these prices to the rest of the modules in NEMS. These prices basically incentivize these different modules to provide CO2, and then we iterate, right? So NEMS is solved using an iterative structure. And at the end, like we have a solution where basically which is an equilibrium, which basically equilibrates like the supply that we receive from these blue boxes and the demand from the green boxes given certain prices that the model solves for. Okay. Oh yeah, this is what I talked about. So it's the centralized optimization allocating CO2 supply to demand. Solving for optimal CO2 flows that minimize total costs. And we take into account obviously physical and physical constraints, such as transportation capacity, demand capacity, and sequestration capacity. Both transportation and sequestration capacity can increase over time with investment, which are decision variables in our model. Okay, so a little bit more about the policy that we represent. As I mentioned, we only include policies as of December 2024. That was our cutoff to be able to publish in April, early this year. To the two important policies that are relevant for CATS are the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act and the EPA Rule 111. So in the 2022 IRA, for the tax credits for carbon capture, which are called 45Q, were expanded and extended. So in that bill, CO2 capture projects have to begin construction by 2033 to qualify, and they receive credits for 12 years. It's $65 for CO2 EOR and $80 for saline storage. EPA Rule 111 doesn't directly have how is EPA Rule 111 related to CATS? So basically, they have provisions for existing coal plants and natural gas plants to limit their emissions. And one of the options that they can do to limit emissions is to install carbon capture technology. So to the extent that these are happening in the power generation sector, they indirectly affect how much CO2 volumes are being supplied to the CATS module. Okay, so what do we produce as results from CATS? So we produce results on a regional level. We also aggregate up. So we saw the optimization on a pretty granular level, but we aggregated up to publish the results for NEMS for AEO 2025. We also run the model for various side case analysis, and this is not just for CATS, this is for AEO, but we have a reference case, which is our baseline case, high and low macro, so high and low economic growth cases, high and low oil price cases, high and low oil gas supply cases, high and low technology costs for zero carbon technologies. We have an alternative electricity case, and this is the case where where EPA Rule 111 is not in place, and then also an alternative transportation case where we don't have the recent CAFE standards and GHG tailpipe standards. Okay, so moving on to our results. So here I'm showing you, I guess, our headline results for the various AEO 2025 side cases. And this is showing the total CO2 that is captured at both electric power and industrial facilities. Basically all the industries that we present in the CATS module are only electric power and industrial facilities. So in the black, you can see the reference case. And I think the main takeaway here is not surprising, which is that captured CO2 kind of peaks between 2035 and 2040 due to the incentives from the 45Q. So the tax credits really incentivize the development of the carbon capture industry. But once those credits expire, so facilities can only receive tax credits for 12 years, captured CO2 starts to decline. We have a range of outcomes depending on the side case. So on the high side, you can see the high oil price case and the high oil and gas supply cases have much higher peaks of carbon capture, but roughly around the same time. So in particular, for the high oil price case, we can see a peak of over 120 million metric tons around 2039. What else is interesting? So on the low end, we can see the alternative electricity case, which again does not have EPA Rule 111, the low oil and gas supply case, and the low oil price cases. I'm going to try to unpack these results a little bit more. So here we're taking a look at the breakout of captured CO2 emissions by source that we receive from other NEMS modules. So I'm showing 2024, which is the first bar here on top, and comparing that to projections for 2035, which are the rest of the bars here. And remember, our peak is roughly around 2030, between 2035 to 2040, depending on the case. So this is roughly around the start of the peak. But I think it gives you a pretty good idea of where the action is happening. So let's take a look at the second bar here, which is the reference case. You can see that the industries that supply CO2 to the system. So we have coal power plants in green, we have ethanol in yellow, hydrogen in red, so they represent steam methane reforming with carbon capture. And then we have natural gas activity, so the natural gas power plants in brown and natural gas processing in blue. So we see the same result as in the previous slide, that the high oil price case, here's some the fifth one here, and the high oil and gas supply case, this fourth one here, have the highest peaks, and we can kind of understand where they're coming from. So a big part of it is due to natural gas activities, in particular natural gas power plants. And also we see an interesting difference between the two. So coal power plants supply more CO2 in the high oil price case, which is when coal power plants become really more economical for power generation. And because of the EPA Rule 111, they have to capture their emissions. And that effect is stronger in the high oil price case relative to the high oil and gas supply case, which doesn't have as high prices. So the relative pricing effect is not as strong. So where are these CO2 captured CO2 supplies going? So here I'm showing you a graph of results for CO2 saline storage and for CO2 EOR. So on the left is saline storage, and we can start with that. So today there are really only a handful of active saline storage formation sites. So these projections really start from zero. As of December 2024, there were about 150 Class 6 well permits that were under review. And we assume that those could be approved and in place when needed by the system, by the CATS model to invest in. It's interesting to see that saline storage peaks roughly around the same time as CO2 supplies. Our main results on CO2 supply peak. So basically, this is really driven by the 45Q tax credits. After the 45Q tax credits expire, CO2 to saline storage also declines pretty dramatically, even here in the reference case. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you CO2 going to EOR. And this one remains pretty consistent throughout the projection period. This is because CO2 EOR has alternative revenue streams that are not just 45Q, even though it's a lower amount compared to saline storage, but the revenue streams coming from the oil and gas industry are able to sustain CO2 supplies going to EOR. Okay, And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about transportation, and to see whether pipeline networks will be built, where pipeline networks will be built. So one way to visualize these results is to basically look at the difference between supplied CO2 and sequestered CO2 by region, right? So if this amount is positive, then that region is basically supplying more than it is sequestering. And then the opposite is true. If this number is negative, then it is sequestering more than it is supplying. So let's, I guess, go look at the negative results first. So the red area here is west south central, basically that Permian Basin area. This is where the results are most pronounced in terms of more sequestration. So captured CO2 supply in this area peaks at around 16 million metric tons, but sequestration rises above 45 million metric tons. So on net, they are taking in more supplies. And where are they taking them from? They're basically taking them from the other regions here on the positive side of the graph. So from the Mid-Atlantic region, the Mountain region, the West North Central region, and East South Central region are all kind of basically sending over their supplies to the West South Central area. So yeah, CO2 facilities and CO2 sequestration sites are not located in the same geographic area, and we see a lot of development of trans-regional pipeline networks in the deployment in our model. Okay, lastly, I wanted to put things into context. So how large are the carbon capture numbers compared to total emissions for the whole US economy? So this chart is showing you gross sector emissions for the industrial sector on the left and power sector on the right, and the percent of those gross emissions that are captured. In 2024, so this first bar on top, and the percent that are captured for the different side cases that we look into in 2035, again, which is when the peak is. So we can see that really across the broad range of side cases that we looked at, CO2 being captured remains a small part. It is really a small fraction of gross emissions. So for the industrial sector, this ranges between 3 to 4% across the different side cases. And then for power sector emissions, this ranges from 4 to 8%, with the exception of alternative electricity. So this is the one where there's no Rule 111, meaning that power plants are not being forced by this policy to capture their emissions. And so for that one, only 1% of emissions are being captured. Okay, and then one last graph, I guess, stepping back. So this shows total energy-related carbon dioxide emissions for the US in AO 2025 across our different side cases. And you can see that it's declining over the projection period. So since 2024, we project that this will decline gradually till 2050. But the main force that is driving this decline is not necessarily the carbon capture industry. So there are other forces in effect that result in this decline. So for example, our economic growth assumptions, which affect consumption, are a pretty strong force that that affect these emissions numbers. And also there's different consumption sector dynamics. So for example, the electric power sector is particularly more responsive to assumptions on the costs of zero carbon technology. And the transportation sector is a little bit more responsive to assumptions about fossil fuel supply and oil prices, petroleum prices. Yeah, so the carbon capture industry relative to this, it remains pretty small according to our results. So some next steps that we want to tackle for future AEOs. Obviously, there have been new policies that have come out, such as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And our team here at EIA is already looking at how to implement those properly to be published in NEMS for future AEOs. In terms of CATS, we really want to look more deeply into natural sources of CO2. So we know that natural sources are really a major source of CO2 for EOR, and maybe you've noticed, but we don't currently represent them in here yet as nodes. So we really want to incorporate that in the model to see how it changes our results. And then lastly, we've gotten a lot of feedback from our stakeholders, including you. So if we have any feedback here on how to better represent carbon capture in the CATS model, we're also taking those into account as part of our model development for the future, for future AEOs. That's it. That's all I have. Thanks, Crystal.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your presentation. Now we've got a good number of audience questions here that I will go through. One we have right here. Are there other modeling efforts that have been done to study this, either at public or private organizations, or is this the first one? How similar were the results, if so?
There are other models that look into this. I think most of those models are what I think of as like partial equilibrium models. So they only look at the carbon capture industry in isolation, right? But here, one of the special things about NEMS is that it incorporates the entire US energy system. So to my knowledge, this is really one of the most detailed ones that have feedback effects between our model and the rest of the models in NEMS, which I think is a pretty key mechanism at play here, right? So in what I described earlier, we receive supplies from other CO2 supplies from other modules, but in turn we provide them with prices, right? So there's this feedback loop going on to help determine our projections. So in terms of other general equilibrium models, I think we are the most detailed. Yeah, so I think those that's what's a little bit special about NEMS. Also, a lot of other models tend to do policy analyses, so and are maybe a little bit more policy focused, but at EIA, because we're a policy neutral organization, we really only focus on existing policies in our model. So we tend not to basically do a lot of scenario analysis with different kinds of policies. Yeah.
Thank you. And our next question here, will EIA publish model inputs and outputs, such as CO2, EOR, demand, transportation, etc.?
Will we publish assumptions? Sorry.
Publish model inputs and outputs.
Yeah. So I think that's already in our assumptions document. If we can talk offline, or please reach out to me offline if you're looking for something in particular. Yeah, but we have a list of our parameters that we use for our mathematical optimization, and yeah, I think those are published. We have links to those online. So the cost assumptions, both on the variable cost side and in the investment cost side for the transportation network, for the saline storage development, and also some of the financial assumptions, so like the lifespan, like debt to equity ratios. I think those are published in our assumptions documents. But yeah, if you're looking for something in particular, please let me know and we can definitely talk offline.
All right, our next question here. How can utilities take action in response to these results? Or in other words, what is your desired outcome or expectation from sharing these results today?
Um, that's a good question. I think so so as I mentioned earlier, EIA is a policy neutral organization. So we want to provide like a baseline set of projections given the existing policies in place and also leveraging all the energy information, all the surveys in EIA that we have, right? So we have very detailed information coming from our Office of Energy Statistics that can inform a lot of the detail in the way that we model the energy system. So we kind of want to leverage that to inform the NEMS, our energy model, but and basically put out projections for what we think is the most likely outcome given what we know, all the information that we have today. Most people, I think, use that as a benchmark for their other results, depending on what you're interested in. But I think our goal here is really to accurately, but also but accurately represent, but also like model it in a simple way that that we can understand the carbon capture model in the context of the larger energy modeling system. But yeah, what is our goal for sharing these results? We we wanted to provide a really good representation of where the trends in the industry are growing. We have interest from different stakeholders that have asked us about, carbon capture industry, and we receive questions from, people on the Hill or practitioners or researchers. And we just wanted to provide basically unbiased analysis, which is our goal at EIA.
Thank you, Anna. Our next question here. Does the model take into account the commercial viability of 45Q driven projects if the tax credit expires after 7 years?
Yes, so we represent 45Q in the model. For the 2022 IRA, the tax credits last 12 years actually. So we take that into account in our modeling. And that's basically what's driving our results, that you see this peak around 2030 to 2040. And then after that, as the different facilities, stop receiving these tax credits, the CO2 captured by various facilities also decline. So really it is the main driver driving our results. We would like to model, there are other policies that incentivize CO2 carbon capture. So there's state level regulations, or so there's that's the next big one, or state level regulations. But I think 45Q, the federal regulations, are really the biggest player.
All right. Would you elaborate what CCATS capabilities for the flexible future policy changes?
Elaborate. Okay. So right now, Okay, that's a good question. So the way we represent policy is basically, okay, let me figure out how to answer this question. Okay, so in the CATS optimization problem, which, as I mentioned, are basically just minimizing total costs, we have a term in there that basically sums up all the policy incentives for the different policies. Right now, we have two policies, so you can think of it as basically summing two types of terms. So one term that captures the policies for CO2 EOR, and then one term that captures it for saline storage. We can easily add other types of policies. So say, for example, the $180 incentive for direct air capture or DAC, we can just kind of append that into our optimization problem. And as different policies come online, since it's an additive kind of structure, it's pretty flexible to add or remove certain policies. And also these policies are specific to the different nodes, which I showed you on the map earlier. So if, in the OBBA, these policies have changed, for example, for EOR, they increased from 65 to 80. So now it's the same incentive as saline storage. So we can just easily update those parameters. So yeah, so it's in the way that we wrote this optimization model that is like a simple additive structure that allows us to incorporate changes in policy pretty quickly, I think.
Wonderful. What would you say is the role of efficiency in the forecasting on carbon emissions and capture, SUB, buildings, production process highly, etc.?
The role of efficiency. So those typically affect the demand sectors a little bit more. So for example, so our four main demand sectors are the transportation sector, which could have efficiency gains, industrial sector also could have efficiency gains, residential and commercial. So basically, to the extent that those efficiency changes affect their energy consumption and how they capture emissions. So for the industrial sector, whether or not they, they retrofit facilities to add carbon capture, and then for residential, commercial, really the ones that go through the electricity sector, right? So to the extent that they have more or less demand for electricity, those are the channels through which they affect our model, the carbon capture model, because really we get all those CO2 supplies endogenously from them. So I think those are like the major ways that could feed through to the CATS model.
Right. Our question here, does the EIA have updated models and projections for other regions, such as the EU, China, India, and the Middle East?
Okay, so international projections. Is this, sorry, could you repeat the question? Is this specific to carbon capture or?
Does the EIA have updated models and projections for other regions? I would assume it's related to carbon capture.
Models and projections. So, so CATS is only in our domestic model. So for the AEO, where we focus on the domestic market, our international analysis is in the IEO, so the International Energy Outlook, and currently we don't have a carbon capture model in the International Energy Outlook. That one is a little bit tougher, also because we don't have a lot of data, first of all. And then the regional markets are going to be very different. I think very different from how it will develop in the US. And then also just physically, these regions, are separated by oceans and waters. So we would have to think about how CO2 really is going to be moving around these different regions. So, I mean, it's a question that we've talked about before, whether we want to look at carbon capture in an international setting, but currently we don't have that yet.
All right, then. We have our next question here. The model results show CO2 reductions tapering off after 2035, but most industry pledges are for minor reductions until then and carbon neutrality by 2050. Does that reflect other measures that will be used to reduce CO2, like renewable energy, instead of carbon capture?
I think I missed the middle part of your question there. Do you mind repeating real quick?
Yes. We have this one here. The model results show CO2 reduction tapering off after 2035, but
Yeah.
most industry pledges are for minor reductions until then and carbon neutrality by 2050. Does that reflect other measures that will be used to reduce CO2, like renewable energy, instead of carbon capture?
Okay, so what I missed that you said was pledges. So yeah, we don't incorporate any pledges or promises or policies that are not in place. We really only focus on existing legislation and regulation. So pledges or any kind of goals for different industries are not going to be incorporated in any of our analysis.
Thank you, Anna. Our next question here. How do your predictions compare with other analyzers who have different assumptions in their models?
Um, I think, I guess I don't really want to speak too much towards other studies. I'm going to try to refrain from speaking to results for other studies because the assumptions are just going to be so different. The model structure is also going to be very different. But I feel like to be able to compare results, I think we're somewhat in the ballpark, but really our results are going to be driven by the energy consumption and the decisions for installing carbon capture in various industries. And those, I think, are a little bit like special to NEMS, again, because of this endogenous way that we model. But yeah, maybe this one I can take offline if they want to reach out to me.
Good to hear that. And this one's about a slide specifically. For the slide 6, would you have any amount regarding to the types as well?
Sorry, for slide 6, would I have any amount on
Regarding the types as well?
the types? Let's see. Regarding which types?
I'm assuming the no types, the archetypes as well.
Would we have any additional information on this? You mean?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, so the carbon capture potential, I'm pretty sure. So we take, okay, I guess there's different pieces to the question. So for the supply side, we take a lot of those capture potentials from the NETL database. The transshipment nodes are basically we assume as a uniform grid. And then for saline storage, EOR demand, so EOR demand we get from the hydrocarbon supply module, and then saline storage information we also get from the NETL model. So I think maybe, I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question properly, but In terms of like the raw parameters that we use, we derive a lot of it from these Nettles studies. And then any kind of like transformation, we describe in the model documentation. So if the question is, yeah, I guess I'm not sure what the question is. Is it like describe the process a little bit more? So that one, I guess, is in our model assumptions document. And also, I'm happy to take this one offline. But for, I think, storage capacities, so for example, these numbers are an assumptions document. And we have a list of the saline storage sites and their capacities. I think it's a CSV link in the assumptions document.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you all for your questions. We will have the presentation and the recording of this webinar available on our webpage within 24 hours, and you also receive an email with all of the information. Thank you again, Anna, for taking the time to come and explain all of this to us.
Thank you very much.
All
Thanks,
right. Well,
Crystal.
everyone, please take care and have a good day. Goodbye.